Hello everyone, welcome to Chess with Mr. Tim. I am Mr. Tim, and whether you are learning how to play chess yourself, or you're a parent looking to teach your kids, or maybe you're a chess coach looking to improve how you teach your lessons, you can use my videos as a resource to improve. I'm going to start with lesson 1. This is the lesson where I teach the kids how to play chess. In other words, how the pieces move, how to set up the board, and the basic rules of the game. If you're teaching a younger group of students, you can break the contents of this lesson into 2 or sometimes 3 different lessons. But I'm going to show you all of it in one video that you can use and pause and restart as needed. So the way that I start this first lesson is I set up the board like this and I say to the kids, let's start talking about chess. Chess is similar to another game in terms of how the board looks. And then I say, does anybody know what game has a similar board? And then the kids raise their hands, and a lot of them are familiar with checkers, so they'll say, this is a checkers board. And I'll say, yes, chess and checkers have a very similar board. The difference is that the chessboard has the letters and numbers on it, which we'll get to later. But another big difference is how the pieces move and how you win the game. So I start off by saying, the letters and numbers are on the board in a chess game so that you can talk about each square on the board, whether you're talking about the lessons or whether you're talking about where the pieces are on the board in the games. So for example, I might say, what square is this piece on? And I say you have to start with the letter and then you have to finish with the number. Each square has a first name and a last name. So this square's first name is B and the last name is 6, B6. And then I'll say, all right, who can tell me what the name of this square is? And then they'll say E5. And what's the name of this square? C1. So that's one of the differences between chess and checkers. And then I say, let's get to the other differences. The chess pieces and the checkers pieces move in different ways. All of the checkers pieces move the same way, but chess has 6 different pieces and each of them moves in a different way. Also, the way that the pieces capture is different. In checkers, the pieces capture by jumping over the other pieces. In chess, you have to take the place of the piece you're capturing. And then the game ends as a win for one player with checkers as a result of capturing the pieces. But in chess, capturing the pieces doesn't determine who wins and loses. You could win without capturing any pieces, or you can win by capturing almost all of the pieces. And then I say, let's get to how the pieces move. So there are 6 different pieces, I say, and I introduce them as the fast pieces and the slow pieces. So first we'll start off with the fast pieces. The first fast piece is this one. And I ask the kids if they know what this is called. A lot of them will raise their hands and say, this is called the castle. And I say, it doesn't look like a castle, but it has a different name. This piece is called the rook. And the rook is one of the 3 fast pieces. The rook is allowed to go up or down or left or right as far as it wants, unless it wants to stop or there's something in the way or it makes a capture. So then I show all the different examples. I say, using the notation we talked about before, I say, let's say that there's a rook on A6 and it wants to go all the way across the board in one turn. It can do that. It can move all the way to H6. Then I might say, let's say that the rook wants to go all the way down. Well, it can't move as far this time because it runs out of space after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares. So it goes all the way down to H1. Now let's say we want to move the rook just 2 spaces. We want to move it to F1. So it just goes 2 spaces to F1. Now let's introduce some other possibilities in the game. Let's say that there's a piece in the way. Let's say that there's a piece on your team that's in the way. Right over there on F4, and we'll get to what that piece is called and how it works in a little bit. But first, let's talk about the fact that it's blocking the rook. Let's say the rook wants to go to F7. It can't go to F7 in one turn because this piece is in the way, and the rook is not a piece that can jump over other pieces. So instead, what it has to do is go around this piece, the pawn. And it can't do that in one turn. You can't go in zigzags with a rook. You can only go in one direction at a time. So it would have to go here and then next turn, it would have to go here, and then next turn, it would have to go here. So that would take 3 moves to get to that spot, but that's because the rook can't jump over pieces. Now let's say, instead of it being a piece on our team, let's say it's a piece on the other team. Let's say you have a piece on f3 that is on the other team. Well, now you have a new option. You can capture that piece. And the way capturing works in chess is you land on the piece that you're capturing. You don't take the piece and then keep going. You can't capture 2 or 3 pieces. Another difference between chess and checkers. You can only take 1 piece per turn, and when you take that piece, your turn is over. So then sometimes I show some other options for capturing and some other possibilities. Like let's say there's a rook maybe over here, like this, on b5. And let's say it wants to take this piece. It can't take that this turn, but maybe it can take this piece, and then next turn it could take that piece. Or if it really wants to, it could go around this one over the course of 3 turns to take that piece. But you have to reinforce that the rook cannot jump over pieces, and once you capture, that's the end of your turn. So I can't be over here and go capture, capture. Not allowed. Then we move on to the next piece. The next piece is called the bishop. The bishop is also a fast piece, but unlike the rook, instead of it going up or down or left or right, the bishop can go diagonally, slanted lines. So you start off with 2 bishops. One of them can only go on the light color squares the whole game, and the other one can only go on the dark color squares. So it doesn't matter where they are on the board, it doesn't matter what's in the way, they can only ever go on the color square that they started on. So if we start off with a bishop over here on the other team and a bishop here on this team, they can never capture each other because they're on different color squares. But let's say that there's a pawn on this team like this. This bishop can capture that one. And if this pawn is on a different square, like let's say it's over here, even though it's right next to the bishop can't take it because the bishop can never switch color squares. It can go as far as it wants each turn diagonally, as long as it's not blocked or as long as it doesn't run out of space on the board, but it can never switch color squares. It can never switch over to the opposite color. Now, I usually go through a few other examples of capturing with the bishop just to make sure that the kids understand. And then we move on to the last fast piece. This one is the queen. And I usually have the kids ask, or I ask the kids what the names of these pieces are. And so let's see if anyone can guess that this is the queen. Some of them might say it's the king because it looks like a crown, but this is the queen. And the queen is the most powerful piece in the game. The queen can do everything that the rook can do, plus everything that the bishop can do. So the rook can go up and down and left and right, and the bishop can go diagonally, both as far as they want, but the queen can do both of those things. It can go up, down, left, right, and diagonally. And this is usually where I give the first quiz to the kids, the first big quiz. I set up the board with pieces all over the place, pieces on your team, pieces on the other team. I set them up all over the place because this quiz is going to be the question, how many choices do I have to capture this turn? How many choices does the queen have to capture? So we'll put some like this, we'll put some like this. Notice that I'm showing a few different examples of pieces that are blocked by other pieces, or pieces that are on the same team, or pieces that are in spots where maybe the queen isn't allowed to move, because I want to make sure that the kids know that just because there are pieces on the board, it doesn't mean that they're in a spot where you can capture them. And also something that we mentioned a little bit before, but I want to reinforce it now. You can capture pieces on the other team, but you can't capture pieces on your team. So the queen is surrounded by pieces, but how many choices does it have for what it can take this turn? Let's see. Can it take its own piece? No, you can't capture your own teammates. Can it go in a zigzag and take this one? No. Can it go in a zigzag and take this one? No. Can you take your own piece? No. Can you go diagonally and take this piece? Yes, so that's 1. Can you go sideways and take this piece? Yes, that's 2. Can you go take your own piece? No. Can you take this piece? Yes, it's 3. Can you jump over this piece and take that piece? No. So this one comes off. Can you go diagonally and take this piece? Yes, that's 4. And if you want to do a few different puzzles like this, just until the kids are pretty confident with how the pieces capture and how it matters where they're set up and where they are in relation to the queen, then you can do that and then move on to the slow pieces. So, like I said, there are 3 fast pieces and 3 slow pieces. The slow pieces are the knight, the pawn, and the king. So I show the knight first because the knight's kind of like a half slow piece. It can move 3 spaces at once, but it's not considered one of the fast ones because it can't go all the way across the board. So the knight moves in a specific shape. And by the way, as I'm going through each of these pieces, I ask the kids first if they know what they're called. So I'll say, do you know what this one's called? Most of them will say the horse, the horsey. I've heard the pony sometimes, but this one is called the knight. The knight moves in a capital L shape. An L shape that is always 3 moves. 1, 2, 3. I've heard this described in a bunch of different ways. I've heard it described as gallop, gallop, step. I've heard it described as 1, 2, turn, 1, 2, turn. But the point is, the knight can move 2 spaces up or down or left or right, and then 1 space in a left or right turn. So we can go 2 spaces down and then 1 space to the right. 2 spaces down, 1 space to the left. 2 spaces left, 1 space up. 2 spaces left, 1 space down. All the way around. 1, 2, turn. 1, 2, turn. And it always makes a capital L shape. It cannot go 2 spaces diagonally. It cannot go 3 spaces forward and not turn. It can't go 3 spaces forward and then turn. It's always 1, 2, turn. And the knight has another special power that no other piece has. You can ask the kids if they know this. Sometimes you'll have a group where somebody will know this answer. The knight can jump over pieces. We said before with the other pieces, the fast pieces, they can't jump over things, but the knight is allowed to jump over other pieces. But you have to make sure the kids know that just because the knight can jump over pieces, it doesn't mean that it can capture those pieces, because this is chess, not checkers. So if you have a knight on, let's say, d4, the knight can't go 1, 2, turn and take this piece. But if you had a knight on d4 and a knight on the other team, or it doesn't matter if it's a knight, we can even make it a queen, let's say. You can go 1, 2, turn and take this piece. You can jump over things on your team. You can jump over things on the other team. It doesn't matter as long as you're making that L shape. So let's say we have a knight over here and there are a bunch of pieces in the way of where we might want to go. So let's say we're over here and we want to try and take this piece. So we can go 1, 2, turn and take that one. We don't get these ones. It doesn't matter that they're in the way because we were able to jump over them with our L shape, but we don't get to capture them. If you want to do a few puzzles with the knight, showing examples of what it could capture, what it can't capture, quizzing the kids, that's always good because the knight is a complicated piece. So is the next one I'm going to go through, the pawn. Now, the pawn is the weakest piece. The pawn is only worth 1 point. And this is usually where I take the time to tell the kids how many points each piece is worth. I'll say that the most powerful pieces, the fast pieces, are the ones that are worth the most. So the rook is a powerful piece. That's worth 5 points. The bishop is a pretty powerful piece. That's worth 3 points. The queen, because it's the most powerful piece, that one's worth 9 points. The knight, it's still the same as the bishop because even though it can't go as far as it wants, it can jump over things. So it's still kind of powerful. Knights and bishops are both 3 points. The pawn is only 1 point. The pawn is just 1. It's the weakest piece. But you start off with 8 pawns. If you're playing as the white pieces, which means that you're setting up on the side of the board with 1 and 2, you get a whole row of pawns on the second row. If you're setting up as the black pieces, you get a whole row of pawns on the 7th row. And the way that you set up the board, we're going to show that afterwards. I usually introduce all the pieces and then I set up the board, is the black piece is set up on this side, white piece is set up on this side. So let's talk about the pawns first. The pawns start off in a big row. I usually don't set up the whole thing just yet to save time. The pawns start off in a big row like this. We'll set up most of them. And from the starting row, the pawns are allowed to move 1 or 2 spaces. So any of these pawns can go 1 or 2 spaces from the starting row. And not just on the first move of the game, anytime a pawn moves for the first time from the starting row, it can move 1 or 2 spaces. 1 or 2 spaces. Some of them might move 1, some of them might move 2. Once you leave the starting row, though, you lose the chance to move 2 spaces. So if you decided only to move 1, that's it. You can only move 1 from then on. And each time that you're moving a pawn, you can only move it forward. You can't move a pawn backwards. You can't move a pawn sideways. You can't move a pawn 4 or 5 spaces. It can only move forward. The exception is when you're capturing. Pawns are the only pieces that capture in a different way from how they move. So if a pawn is moving forward, but there's something in the way, it's stuck. You can't capture this piece, it's stuck. The way that you capture with a pawn is you move diagonally forward. So you can go diagonally like that, you can go diagonally like that, but you can't capture forward with a pawn. 1 space forward diagonally. So you can't capture like a bishop or a queen where you're going all the way like this. It's just 1 space forward diagonally. You can't capture backwards with a pawn. You can't capture sideways with a pawn. 1 space forward diagonally. So like I said, even though the pawn's a weak piece, it has a lot of these exceptions to how it moves. There's one more exception to talk about. If a player manages to get a pawn all the way to the other side of the board, they get to do what's called pawn promotion. That's where you get to turn your pawn into a new piece. And make sure you express that rule clearly, because a lot of players learn the incorrect way of thinking about the rule, which is that if you get a pawn to the other side of the board, you get a piece back. That's not correct, because even if you haven't lost any pieces yet, you can still turn your pawn into a queen or a rook or a bishop or a knight. You don't have to choose from the captured pieces. You can have 2 queens on the board or 3 queens on the board. And since we talked about how the queen is the most valuable piece, the most powerful piece, players will usually choose the queen if they get a pawn to the other side of the board. So remember to describe that clearly. You don't get a piece back, you get a new piece. So if I march this all the way to the other side of the board, I get to turn that into a new piece, and the new piece goes right on the spot where that pawn was, and the pawn comes off the board. So that's the pawn. We've got 1 piece left to talk about, the king. And the king is a weak piece too. It's not a fast piece, it's a slow piece. It is only allowed to move 1 space at a time in every direction, 1 space. So it's like a slower version of the queen. But the king has a very important rule that it has to follow. It is never allowed to move into danger. And because it's never allowed to move into danger, it can never be captured. Now that might come as a big surprise to a lot of players, because a lot of players learn the very common, very incorrect rule that you win the game by taking the king. That is not true. The king can never be captured. So I usually talk about how to win the game in my second lesson, but now we can stop at saying the king never gets captured. If the kids encounter a situation in which the king is in danger in their games after the first lesson, then you could say, oh, the king has to get out of danger, but we'll get into check and checkmate in lesson 2. Now let's talk about quickly how we set up the board. So like we said, the white piece is set up on the side with 1, the black piece is set up on the side with 8. And I usually have a little song that I teach the kids for setting up. So we put the rooks in the corners like this. And I say, put the rooks down left and right. Then you put their friend the knight. The knight goes as the next piece. Bishops go on F and C. So we have one bishop go on F and one bishop go on C. So there's one bishop there for F, one bishop for C, and then the most important part, this gets confused very frequently, queen on D and king on E. So the queen matches its square and the king is the opposite of its square. So if you're playing as the white pieces mirror that on the bottom. So the white queen will go on D. Queen always has to match its color square, right? So the white queen goes on D and the white king goes on E. All of the pieces face each other. So then the next thing is the pawns. We'll just set up the pawns quickly, like this, and then you can replicate this for the white pieces on the other side of the board. And then I'll repeat the song again just so that everybody knows how it gets set up. Like this. So, put the rooks down left and right, then you put their friend the knight. Bishops go on F and C, queen on D and king on E. And the pawns just go in front. The pawns don't need a special song. And then you do the same thing with the white pieces. The white rooks go in the corners. The white knights go next to it. The white bishops go on F and C. The white queen goes on D. The white king goes on E. And the pawns go in front. And that's how you set it up. And then I say, all right, kids, get your boards out. Start setting it up like this, and you can start your games. Like I said, this will sometimes take a few different classes to go through. This was a very material dense lesson. But if you're with an older group, sometimes you can speed through it in one class. Good luck, everyone.